They never hated each other. Yet one by one, they helped destroy the next. The Tudor court turned queens into rivals long before they understood the rules. Every smile hid a warning. Every alliance carried a cost. And every survival demanded a quiet betrayal. Tonight, you will walk beside them and feel how fear reshaped even the simplest bond. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand inside the great halls of Henry VIII's court, the first impression would be brilliance. Polished floors, velvet garments, jeweled crowns. But beneath that brightness lay a world that pressed heavily on the women who moved through it. The court praised them, displayed them, and placed them at the center of ceremonies. Yet every gesture they made was measured against expectations they did not choose. Power surrounded them, but none of it truly belonged to them. They were raised high so they could be seen, and kept close so they could be used. Life in this world was shaped by the king's shifting desires and the ambitions of the men who served him. Every marriage, every alliance, every ceremony carried political weight. A queen was not merely a wife, she was a symbol of diplomacy, legitimacy, and religious alignment. Her body was tied to the fate of the realm, yet her voice carried little authority. In the eyes of the court, she was valuable only as long as she served the needs of the throne. When she faltered, or when the king's affections moved elsewhere, her importance dissolved with alarming speed. The pressure on these women was constant. Marriage to Henry VIII was not an act of personal union, but a political maneuver. And each queen entered the palace knowing she would be judged by her ability to secure succession and satisfy the ideological goals of the crown. Their lives were wrapped tightly around questions of inheritance and national identity, matters far larger than any individual could control. Behind every smile they offered and every public appearance they made was the quiet knowledge that their position could vanish without warning. This uncertainty shaped the atmosphere of the court. A queen's throne looked solid, carved in heavy wood and embellished with gold. Yet it was the most fragile seat in England. Each woman knew her time as the king's chosen figure was temporary. The court demanded grace, obedience, and resilience. But it offered no lasting protection. A rumor could weaken a queen. A political shift could isolate her. A failure to produce a male heir could destroy her entirely. To live in this space meant accepting a life of ceremony without security. The queens walked through corridors lined with tapestries that glorified power. Yet they themselves were denied true agency. Every decision was filtered through male authority. Counselors, clerics, diplomats, and the king himself. Their influence existed only in narrow corridors, where a gesture, a whisper, or a well-timed silence might sway opinion. Yet these moments were rare and easily undone. The women who entered Henry VIII's world often came from noble families, accustomed to negotiation and strategic marriage. But nothing could fully prepare them for the instability of this court. They arrived with hope, dignity, and the expectation that their upbringing had prepared them for a life of prominence. Instead, they discovered an environment where admiration turned into scrutiny and affection into suspicion. Their names were praised in public but analyzed in private, dissected for signs of weakness or threat. In such a place, even the rituals meant to honor queens held a hidden edge. Coronations elevated them before the eyes of the nation. Yet every celebration reminded them that they were stepping into a role shaped by others, one that demanded submission, even as it displayed majesty. Their jewels glimmered, but the weight of political expectation pressed far heavier than gold. They were surrounded by attendants, musicians, scholars, and ambassadors, but few genuinely saw them as individuals. They were symbols first, people second. This tension between elevation and erasure defined the existence of every queen who stood beside Henry VIII. They were honoured publicly, yet dismissed privately. Cherished, momentarily, yet replaceable entirely. Their power was borrowed, their future uncertain, and their survival dependent on a system designed without their benefit in mind. The court could lift them into glory or cast them into isolation, and the transition between the two could occur within a single season. To live under such conditions meant constantly negotiating between appearance and truth. Outwardly, queens were serene, graceful, and composed, fulfilling their ceremonial roles without flaw. Inwardly, they grappled with fear, caution, and the knowledge that each day might bring a shift in the king's mood or political need. Their beauty, their lineage, their alliances, all of it could protect them. Yet none of it could guarantee safety. They existed in a world that celebrated them loudly while erasing them quietly. And so the court of Henry VIII became both a stage and a trap. The queens walked their pathways with measured steps, aware of the watching eyes that judged their behaviour, their fertility, their composure, and even their silence. They were raised above the crowd, yet pressed beneath the weight of expectations. They were praised as pillars of the realm, yet denied the autonomy that true power required. Everything around them was grand, and everything beneath that grandeur was precarious. These early signs of contradiction revealed how fragile a queen's place truly was, even when the court appeared calm. As the balance of alliances shifted, the roles imposed on these women began to tighten around them, and in the quiet of those gilded rooms, the first cracks of rivalry formed long before anyone dared to speak of them. Life inside the Tudor court unfolded through layers of influence so tangled that no woman could navigate them alone. The structure appeared orderly from a distance. Nobles in their appointed places, servants at their posts, queens surrounded by ladies. But beneath that calm surface stretched a maze of overlapping factions. Every hallway carried the quiet friction of competing ambitions. Every chamber held alliances that could shift as swiftly as candlelight. For the women who lived within these walls, the court was not simply a place of service or ceremony. It was a landscape that demanded constant awareness, careful alignment, and a steady understanding that each step was taken on uncertain ground. A woman entering this world quickly learned that her survival depended on her ability to recognize these networks of influence and attach herself to the right ones. The men controlled decisions, titles, judgments, and the machinery of the state. But the women formed the invisible currents that moved between them. They carried messages, interpreted moods, and shaped the tone of daily life. Yet their own positions were fragile. No protection was permanent. A lady favoured one month might be ignored the next, and a queen surrounded by admirers could become isolated in a single season. Such instability forced women to build connections with one another, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. The hierarchy of the court did not shield them from its dangers. Even high-ranking women felt the weight of male authority pressing down on their choices. They operated in narrow spaces, where influence had to be crafted indirectly, through quiet gestures, carefully chosen words, or the sympathetic presence of trusted companions. Without the support of other women, even a queen could find herself dangerously exposed. Every glance from a counsellor, every whisper in the gallery, every change in the king's expression could place her footing at risk. To stand alone was to invite collapse. Women recognized this truth instinctively. Their alliances were shaped by urgency rather than sentiment, and what began as mere necessity often grew into something deeper. They observed one another closely, forming judgments from small cues. A controlled breath, a delayed response, a shift in posture when a name was mentioned. These details revealed loyalties, fears, and the invisible tensions that defined the room. When a woman sensed another standing under the same pressures, something like affinity began to form. It was not always friendship in the emotional sense, but it was a bond built on understanding and mutual protection. Yet these connections existed within an environment that never truly allowed ease. The court discouraged open solidarity among women because unity made them harder to control. Men benefited from quiet divisions, from the uncertainty that kept women cautious. This dynamic forced alliances into secrecy, shared behind closed doors or expressed through subtle signals rather than declarations. The trust required to maintain these ties grew slowly, and even when it was strong, it was shadowed by the knowledge that circumstances could change without warning. Every woman lived with the fear that the person who supported her today might be compelled to withdraw that support tomorrow. Still, they relied on each other because no alternative existed. In the presence of male authority, women served as one another's interpreters, confidants, and shields. They helped one another endure the demands of public display, the scrutiny of foreign ambassadors, the weight of fertility expectations, and the constant reminder that a woman's worth at court could be recalculated in an instant. These pressures strengthened the bonds between them, forging relationships that might begin as strategic cooperation, but developed into forms of closeness shaped by shared vulnerability. This closeness, however, carried its own risks. The same intimacy that provided safety also revealed weaknesses that could later be used against them. The court was relentless in transforming private details into public consequences. Women who confided in the wrong person could find their fears turned into accusations. Those who offered comfort too openly could be marked as partisan. Those who hesitated to choose sides might vanish into insignificance. Survival demanded participation. Even the act of remaining neutral was interpreted as a choice. Despite these dangers, the women continued to form connections because these ties were the only structures protecting them from isolation. Within the constant motion of factions rising and falling, these alliances offered brief moments of steadiness. They shared warnings, exchanged observations, and watched over one another during the unpredictable shifts of the king's attention. Some found in these alliances the only place where they could speak honestly, even if only in fragments, about the burden of being seen yet unheard in a world defined by male command. But the court did not reward permanence. Alliances that once provided safety could tighten into traps as circumstances changed. A queen's decline could pull down her household. A misinterpreted glance could divide loyal companions. A new political crisis could demand sudden realignment. The women understood that the same necessity that bound them together could one day press them apart. Their shared dependence made their connections strong, and their shared vulnerability made those connections fragile. They lived with this contradiction daily. In the Tudor court, women survived by forming bonds that allowed them to stand against the pressures imposed on them. These alliances were born not from freedom but from constraint, not from sentiment but from shared struggle. They were the quiet foundations upon which women built their safety in a world that offered them none. This fragile network sustained them even as competing forces tightened around their lives. As the demands of power deepened, the ties that held them together began to strain under the weight of shifting loyalties. And within those quiet strains, the first hints of conflict waited to rise. They did not arrive at court as rivals. Most of them stepped through its gates with a sense of wonder, carrying the optimism typical of those who believed their positions would bring companionship rather than conflict. The early days were marked by gestures of kindness, shared glances across long tables, whispered reassurances during ceremonies, quiet moments of support when the weight of court rituals grew heavy. Women offered one another guidance, explained customs, and extended small courtesies that softened the overwhelming vastness of palace life. These beginnings were gentle, sincere, and rooted in the belief that the presence of another woman might provide stability in a world governed almost entirely by men. Their alliances formed naturally in those first weeks and months. They learned from each other, leaned on one another, and found comfort in the only people who understood the peculiar expectations placed upon them. They were sisters in circumstance, sharing the same narrow chambers of influence, the same obligations of display, and the same dangers concealed behind the grandeur of the court. It was within this fragile unity that they first learned to navigate the pressures around them. Their connections felt safe then, strengthened by common purpose rather than divided by ambition. Yet the court was not designed to preserve these bonds. Its structure rewarded compliance and punished those who lingered on the edges of shifting factions. Every woman, whether queen or lady, eventually discovered that her position depended not on the quality of her character, but on the alignment of forces around her. Favor from the king could elevate one woman and cast another into doubt. A small change in political strategy could turn an ally into a liability. The closeness that once protected them became a source of vulnerability because the court treated relationships not as emotional ties, but as possible threats. This transformation rarely happened suddenly. It crept forward quietly, shaped by the slow tightening of power around them. Rumors began to circulate, not out of malice, but out of the natural movement of court life. A gesture misread, a word repeated, a silence interpreted in the wrong context. These small details accumulated until a woman found herself recast in the eyes of others. The sisterhood that once seemed so steady began to fracture under pressures none of them had chosen. They were no longer viewed as companions sharing the same path, but as figures whose futures could influence, challenge, or endanger the ambitions of others. It was not personal bitterness that divided them. Most of these women would have preferred to maintain their fragile unity, to continue offering the support that had helped them through their earliest anxieties. But the court repeatedly placed them in positions where their survival conflicted with their loyalties. When the king's attention shifted, when a new alliance was needed, or when suspicion emerged, they were forced to reconsider the very relationships that had shaped their daily lives. What began as a bond became a calculation. What once felt safe began to feel precarious. Each woman discovered that her security could be threatened by another's rise. Not because that rise was malicious, but because the court interpreted ambition as a limited resource. Only one woman could hold the king's favor. Only one household could influence matters of succession. Only one group could remain near the center of political activity. The structure of power imposed a scarcity that none of them could escape. They found themselves pulled into an unspoken competition, even when their hearts inclined toward friendship. Survival required choices that left marks they never intended to make. In this environment, the turning away was quiet, almost invisible. A woman might distance herself from another not because she wished harm, but because she sensed danger in continuing too closely. A smile became restrained, a conversation shorter, a shared ritual gradually abandoned. These changes could happen slowly enough that neither woman could point to a single moment of rupture. Yet both felt the shift. The court, with all its rigid expectations, reshaped its connections until its earlier unity dissolved into caution. This painful drift was not the result of flaws in their characters, but of the court's relentless mechanisms. Its power did not simply govern their actions, it infiltrated their relationships, bending their decisions toward protection rather than companionship. The women learned that trust itself carried risks. To care too openly for another could be interpreted as forming a faction. To defend someone under scrutiny could be seen as opposition to the crown. Under such conditions, affection became dangerous, and distance became a means of survival. By the time their alliances broke, the women themselves often could not explain when or why the shift had begun. They remembered the early days of closeness, the shared prayers, the laughter during preparations for ceremonies, the whispered encouragements before facing long audiences. But those memories could not shield them from the consequences of the court's design. Their rivalry was not something they chose. It was something shaped for them. imposed quietly through the pressures they endured. The tragedy of their stories lies in this inevitability. They did not enter the court with hatred. They learned it only as a response to danger. They did not seek to undermine one another. They were forced into positions where survival meant stepping back from the very people who had once given them support. What looked from the outside like betrayal was, from within, a series of reluctant adjustments to a system that offered no safe alternative. In the Tudor court, women did not become enemies because they wished to be. They became enemies because the structure they lived within allowed no space for lasting solidarity. The court rewarded division and punished loyalty, reshaping their relationships until they barely recognized the shifts taking place. These quiet beginnings of division revealed how the court could twist even the gentlest connections into wary distance. As pressures intensified, the ties that once steadied them were stretched thin by forces beyond their control. In that widening uncertainty, the first irreversible breaks waited to emerge. Catherine of Aragon entered the Tudor world with a presence that seemed immovable, shaped by years of royal upbringing and reinforced by a quiet resilience that impressed nearly everyone who observed her. She carried the dignity of a foreign princess, the discipline of a devout believer, and the calm confidence of someone raised to understand the weight of crowns. When she took her place beside Henry VIII, the court looked to her as the model of what a queen should be: gracious in ceremony, steady in judgment, and unwavering in her sense of duty. For many women serving at court, she embodied a kind of guidance. Her composure offered reassurance in an environment that shifted constantly, and her steadiness created a rare sense of reliability. Her role extended beyond public display. Catherine shaped the expectations assigned to future queens, establishing standards by which all who followed her would be measured. She demonstrated how a queen might balance deference with influence, how she could maintain dignity in the presence of powerful men, and how she could serve as both a symbolic figure and an active participant in governance. Her intelligence was evident in the way she managed her household, negotiated religious matters, and supported political decisions when asked. To the women around her, these actions revealed a figure who not only held authority, but also understood how to wield it within the limits imposed on her. Admiration for Catherine grew naturally. Many women at court found in her a source of stability, especially during moments when the king's interests drifted unpredictably. She listened with patience, offered quiet counsel, and provided an example of endurance that resonated deeply with those who served her. Ladies-in-waiting relied on her sense of fairness. Younger noblewomen looked to her for guidance. Even those who disagreed with her privately respected the clarity of her purpose. Catherine became a centre point, a calm presence in a court full of uncertain alliances. Yet the very qualities that had earned her respect eventually contributed to her isolation. As the years passed and her ability to provide a male heir remained uncertain, the court began to shift in ways she could not control. Her deep connection to the old order, traditional religious authority, diplomatic ties to Spain, and a vision of queenship grounded in stability started to appear out of alignment with the ambitions of the crown. Political winds blew in new directions, carrying ideas and pressures that cast her virtues as remnants of a fading era. What once symbolized strength began to be framed as inflexibility. Catherine sensed these changes with a clarity that only made them more painful. The court she had helped shape gradually loosened around her. Conversations she once participated in slipped beyond her reach. Members of her household, once steady in their loyalty, began to feel the pull of shifting alliances. They did not abandon her outright. Instead, they became cautious, speaking with softened voices and careful phrases. Their uncertainty reflected the growing belief that supporting Catherine meant resisting the momentum of the kingdom's political transformation. She maintained her dignity through these transitions, holding to her beliefs even as the court moved away from them. Her religious devotion, once admired, now appeared to some as an obstacle to the king's will. Her lineage, once a diplomatic advantage, became a point of tension as England sought to redefine its alignment with foreign powers. Every aspect of Catherine's identity that had once elevated her now risked exposing her to scrutiny. She stood firm, but firmness in a court ruled by shifting desires carried consequences. The court's perception of her changed gradually, but the weight of that change settled heavily. She became recognized not as a guiding presence, but as a symbol of the past, a reminder of alliances the king no longer prioritized, of traditions he sought to loosen, and of expectations he wished to escape. Catherine watched as younger women drew the attention she once held, and as their presence introduced new dynamics she could not fully influence. These women were not her enemies. They were simply moving with a current she had long resisted. Despite her growing isolation, Catherine remained committed to the responsibilities she believed were inseparable from her role. She continued to perform her duties with precision, offering the same steadiness that had once won her admiration. Yet each act of consistency seemed to underscore the widening distance between her and the world around her. She had shaped the framework of queenship, but that framework no longer aligned with the evolving priorities of the court. Her loyalty to her principles placed her in quiet opposition to the changes unfolding around her. As her isolation deepened, Catherine's presence took on a kind of stillness. She became a figure both respected and avoided, admired yet increasingly sidelined. Her influence faded, not through fault, but through the relentless movement of power, reshaping itself around demands she could not fulfill. What remained was a queen who had given the court its foundation, but found herself standing at its edges as new ambitions rose to replace the structures she had embodied. Her decline from central figure to distant symbol revealed how quickly the court could turn its gaze away from the very woman who once defined its ideals. As new forces gathered momentum, her steady presence became overshadowed by the shifting desires shaping England's future. Within that quiet displacement, the conditions for deeper fractures in the realm of queens were beginning to form. Anne Boleyn's early days at court carried none of the sharpness that would later define her story. She entered the Tudor world as a young woman whose presence attracted curiosity more than suspicion. The women around her, particularly those who served close to Queen Catherine, regarded her with a mix of warmth and guidance. They helped her understand the rhythm of court life, how to navigate ceremonies, how to maintain composure under watchful eyes, how to move gracefully through a world where silence often carried more weight than words. Their support was genuine, formed from the assumption that Anne would remain one of many women learning to serve without disrupting the order that defined their existence. At first, Anne occupied a position that felt safe. She was admired for her refinement, her education, her sharp intelligence, and the understated elegance that distinguished her from others. Yet these qualities, which initially drew admiration from women and men alike, soon began to alter her place in the delicate network of alliances. Attention gathered around her in a way that could not be ignored. Her wit, her charm, and her refusal to fade into the background made her stand out in a court that rewarded subtlety. Those who had once extended kindness began to sense a shift, not because Anne changed overnight, but because the court reacted to her with an intensity that signaled she no longer belonged to the quiet ranks of unnoticed ladies. Her ascent did not move slowly. It grew rapidly, shaped by the king's growing fascination. The speed of this transformation unsettled the women who had once welcomed her. Their unease was not rooted in jealousy, but in the understanding that court life punished disruption. Anne's rise threatened to destabilize the fragile balance they relied upon. It forced them to reconsider their positions, their alliances, and the risks that came with proximity to someone gaining power too quickly. The court demanded caution, and Anne's growing prominence rendered caution difficult for anyone associated with her. As the king's interest deepened, the air around Anne thickened with scrutiny. Conversations shifted when she entered a room. Glances followed her steps, Whispers travelled through the palace. Not all of them unkind, but all of them signalling that her role was beginning to change. Women who had once treated her with ease now approached her more carefully. They sensed that her proximity to the king placed her at the centre of political currents they could not fully read. A woman rising through the king's favour was never just a companion. She became a signal of transformation, of ambitions taking shape, of old structures weakening. The burden of this transformation settled on Anne before she fully realised it. Her elevation meant that every choice she made, every gesture she offered, held implications beyond personal preference. She could no longer rely on the support that had once surrounded her. Those who had guided her now watched her more closely, aware that their futures might be shaped by her decisions. The court did not allow a woman in Anne's position to remain neutral. Her rise demanded alignment, and alignment demanded the selection of allies and the quiet distancing from others. When Anne moved closer to queenship, the pressure intensified. The women of the court divided around her in ways she could not control. Some saw in her the possibility of new influence, new opportunities, and new power structures they might access. Others recognized the cost of her ascent, the displacement of Catherine, the reshaping of religious alliances, the inevitable conflict that would follow. Anne found herself standing at the center of a shifting structure that required her to choose a side. She could no longer exist as a figure welcomed by all. The crown she approached carved lines around her that could not be crossed without consequence. The act of choosing a faction did not make Anne ruthless. It made her a participant in the court's demands. The system left no woman untouched by its expectations. To survive, she had to associate herself with those who could secure her position and distance herself from those whose ties to Catherine placed them at odds with the king's intentions. Her decisions, though strategic, carried the appearance of betrayal to those who had once offered her kindness. The shift was not personal, it was structural. Anne simply moved along the path the court laid before her, even as she understood that each step altered her relationships irreversibly. As her influence grew, the perception of her shifted from admired figure to potential threat, not because she sought to harm those around her, but because her existence at the center of power disrupted long-standing expectations. Women who once shared moments of companionship with her now approached with restraint. They saw in her not the young woman they had once supported, but a force the king had chosen, a force capable of altering their fates. Her rise magnified every flaw whispered about her, every misstep, every gesture taken out of context. The court did not tolerate rapid ascent without demanding a price. By the time Anne stepped fully into queenship, she no longer occupied the shared space she had once known. She had become a figure surrounded by admiration, fear, opportunity, and danger, all at once. Her position required constant defense, and her alliances had to be constructed with precision. The same women who once stood beside her now measured their distance carefully, aware that attachment to her carried risks that could not be ignored. Her transformation from sheltered companion to perceived threat revealed how swiftly the court recast a woman once embraced by all. As her crown drew closer, the walls around her tightened, reshaping every bond she had formed. In the tension of that narrowing space, the foundations of a deeper conflict were already beginning to take hold. The first true fracture in the world of Tudor women appeared not through open conflict, but through the quiet displacement of Catherine of Aragon. Her removal from the centre of power did not begin with force. It began with distance. Rooms she once entered with assurance grew colder. Conversations that once opened for her now closed as she approached. The court shifted subtly at first, then, unmistakably, until the queen who had defined its order found herself standing on the outer edge of a world she had helped shape. Her presence, once essential, became inconvenient. Her role, once unshakable, became something the crown wished to discard. The women around Catherine felt this shift before they dared to acknowledge it aloud. They had served her faithfully, relied on her guidance, and built their sense of safety around the stability she represented. Yet, as the king's intentions hardened, as Anne Boleyn's rise gathered unstoppable momentum, the women understood that loyalty to Catherine could now place them at risk. The court's atmosphere made that reality unmistakable. A silence began to spread. Not hostile, not deliberate, but heavy with survival. Words of reassurance faded. Gestures of closeness grew smaller. The distance they created was not born from betrayal, but from fear of being pulled into the widening gap between the Queen and the King. Catherine herself recognized the signs. She maintained her dignity, even as the court structure repositioned itself around her absence. Her chambers became quieter. Fewer letters arrived. The flow of information that had once passed naturally through her now moved elsewhere. Women visited less frequently, offering excuses about duties or obligations, though both sides understood the reason for their retreat. Catherine bore these shifts with a composure shaped by years of discipline. But the isolation deepened with each passing month. She had been the center of female solidarity, and now she became a reminder of the cost of misplaced allegiance. For the women who had once relied on her strength, the transformation was agonizing. They had admired her steadiness, learned from her judgment, and found comfort in her presence. Yet the court left them no room to remain beside her, openly. Supporting Catherine meant standing against the king's desires, and opposition to the crown, even silent, even unspoken, carried consequences. Their withdrawal was not an act of cruelty. It was a calculation forced upon them by a system that punished anyone perceived as resisting the direction of power. Each woman learned that in the Tudor court, survival required silence more often than loyalty. This silence spread through the halls like a warning. Women who once moved easily between Catherine's household and the wider court now guarded their steps, aware that their associations were being watched. Even small acts of kindness toward Catherine carried weight. A visit, a message, a prolonged conversation. Any of these could be interpreted as defiance, and so they reduced their gestures. Not because their respect for Catherine had diminished, but because the court offered no safe way to express it. Their restraint was a form of self-preservation in a world where allegiance could determine one's fate. Catherine carried herself with the same steadiness she had always shown. But the structure around her had shifted beyond recovery. The king's determination, Anne's presence, and the political pressures shaping England created an environment where Catherine's position was no longer compatible with the ambitions of the court. Her identity as queen had once given other women a foundation from which to navigate their own paths. Now it placed them in jeopardy. Catherine's fall pulled at the lives of every woman connected to her, forcing them into decisions they had long hoped to avoid. These women mourned the loss of security that Catherine's influence had provided. Yet they had little choice but to adapt. Their withdrawal was quiet, gradual, and painful. They did not speak against her. They did not renounce her. They simply stepped back, one by one, until Catherine remained surrounded only by those whose positions were already too fragile to lose. The court did not demand dramatic betrayal. It demanded absence. The women complied because refusing meant risking more than reputation. It threatened their families, their stability, and sometimes their very existence. As Catherine's presence faded from the center of power, the court rearranged itself without hesitation. New alliances formed. New priorities emerged. The routines that had once revolved around her shifted toward Anne. The transformation revealed something essential about the Tudor world. That affection, trust, and gratitude held little weight against the forces of political necessity. Catherine became a symbol, not of authority, but of vulnerability. A reminder that even the most respected queen could be pushed aside when her existence conflicted with the ambitions of others. The emotional cost of this shift lingered in the spaces where women once whispered to her with confidence, in the corners where they once gathered in her presence, in the routines she had shaped that now moved forward without her. Her isolation marked the first visible break in the unity that had once defined the women of the Tudor court. Catherine's fall showed them that survival required sacrifice, and that the first sacrifice demanded of them would always be loyalty. Her removal from the centre of power revealed how easily the court could unravel the bonds that once held its women together. As silence spread and alliances shifted, the fragile unity they relied upon began to fracture beneath the weight of political necessity. Within that quiet retreat, deeper conflicts were already waiting to surface. The Tudor court did not need open violence to turn women against one another. It relied instead on proximity. Who stood nearest to the king? Who held his attention longest? Who appeared beside him when decisions were made? That nearness determined who remained safe and who drifted toward danger. Women learned quickly that their survival depended on being visible in the right ways and invisible to others. Proximity was interpreted as favor, and favor as security. Those without it found themselves pushed toward the uncertain edges of court life, where a single misstep could erase them quietly. The court measured them not by loyalty or virtue, but by their usefulness to the king's shifting desires. This reality shaped every interaction, every gesture, every choice. A woman who caught the king's interest, even briefly, could rise swiftly through a hierarchy that pretended to value order. Yet, that rise carried its own peril. The closer she stood to him, the further others stepped back, wary of being associated with a figure whose position could break as quickly as it formed. Women noticed these changes before they could articulate them. A shift in conversation, a sudden pause in a corridor, the way their names appeared or vanished in the rhythm of court duties. These subtle signs revealed where power was concentrating and from whom it was withdrawing. Those who represented the past, old alliances, old loyalties, old expectations, found themselves slowly erased from relevance. Their identities became burdens rather than strengths. The court, which once celebrated consistency, now demanded adaptability. A woman connected to a fading faction felt the pressure immediately. She became a reminder of what the king wished to discard. Her presence suggested resistance, even if she remained silent. The court responded by distancing itself from her, not through hostility, but through a steady withdrawal of attention. She became a figure others avoided, too openly defending. This distancing did not require active betrayal. It required silence. Silence became the most reliable tool for survival, a way to avoid entanglement in conflicts that could swallow entire households. When the court turned against a woman, or simply shifted its focus away from her, those around her had to choose between standing near her and risking the king's disapproval, or stepping aside to preserve their own futures. Most chose the latter. Their silence was not born of cruelty, it was born of fear. They understood that a single expression of loyalty could be interpreted as defiance. And defiance had consequences that moved swiftly through the labyrinth of Tudor politics. Women learned to speak less, to observe more, to let events unfold without placing themselves within the centre of danger. Even friendships became fraught with risk. A comforting word could be overheard. A small gesture of support could be misinterpreted. Those who once relied on one another discovered that the court punished visible solidarity. The safest choice was retreat. A quiet, careful retreat that preserved one's own position while allowing another woman to fall alone. In a world where the king's preference determined all outcomes, self-preservation became the unspoken rule. This environment created tensions that did not need to be named. Women sensed the shifts in the air, the tightening of boundaries around those who had lost favor, the delicate caution with which others approached them. They recognized that every woman's vulnerability affected their own. Yet the structure of the court offered no space for collective resistance. Each woman stood on uncertain ground, making calculations from one moment to the next, guided by changes in expression. Tone, or the faintest sign of the king's displeasure. The court itself used these dynamics to maintain control, ensuring that women depended on proximity to the king for protection. It prevented them from forming alliances strong enough to challenge male authority. Even unintentional closeness to a rising figure could reshape the politics of an entire household. A woman appearing too often near someone on the verge of downfall risked sharing her fate. Thus, relationships formed and dissolved with startling speed. Women adapted not because they wanted to, but because the system allowed no alternative. The tragedy of this structure lay in its subtlety. No decrees were issued demanding separation. No proclamations announced who should be shunned or supported. The court operated through implication, through the unspoken understanding that safety required distance from those marked by decline. The women who chose silence felt the weight of their decision. Yet they continued, because silence preserved their standing. And standing meant survival. Over time, this pattern reshaped the emotional geography of the court. Compassion became a luxury. Loyalty became a calculated risk. Even the smallest alliances were evaluated through the lens of future danger. Women did not wish to harm one another, but the court positioned them as pieces within a system that rewarded isolation and punished solidarity. Each step forward required stepping away from someone else. Each act of self-preservation deepened the divides between them. It was in these unspoken withdrawals, not in open conflict, that the court achieved its quiet goal. Women became instruments of their own separation, pushed to act in ways that protected themselves at the expense of relationships they had once valued. Their silence became both shield and weapon, used not to attack, but to survive within a world that left little room for genuine loyalty. These patterns of distance and caution revealed how the court molded women into participants in its own machinery of exclusion. As proximity to the king hardened into the measure of survival, the bonds between them thinned under the steady pressure of fear. From that narrowing space, the seeds of deeper rivalry waited quietly for their moment to surface. Jane Seymour entered the heart of the Tudor court with a quietness that contrasted sharply with the turmoil surrounding her. She did not possess Anne Boleyn's bold presence or Catherine of Aragon's commanding steadiness. Instead, Jane carried herself with a deliberate softness, a calm patience that drew little attention, yet offered an unobtrusive refuge for those weary of conflict. Her demeanour made her seem harmless, a woman who wished only to serve dutifully and remain untouched by the fierce winds of ambition. Yet the court, shaped by its own relentless logic, quickly positioned her as the successor to a throne that was being stripped from another woman's hands. Her rise was not built on loud declarations or calculated gestures. It was built on Anne's collapse. The court, which had once celebrated Anne's influence, turned sharply against her, leaving a space where favour had once rested. Jane stepped into that space almost without motion, as though the court itself pushed her forward. She became the figure around whom new alliances began to gather, not because of any overt claim she made, but because her presence offered a quiet contrast to the turbulence Anne had grown unable to escape. Her stillness was read as virtue, her modesty as obedience, and her gentle manner as a welcome alternative to a queen whose very existence now unsettled the realm. Women around her recognized this shift immediately. They had witnessed the fall of queens before, and they sensed the same pattern forming again. Jane's mildness seemed to promise safety, and safety carried great value in a court where loyalty could be punished, and silence could be misinterpreted. Some women approached Jane with cautious deference, hoping that aligning themselves with her might offer stability. Others watched her from a distance, uncertain whether her rise was the result of her own intent or the product of forces beyond her control. The truth was that even Jane herself could not fully see the machinery moving around her. Her strategy, or what appeared to be one, was simple. She remained outwardly humble. She lowered her gaze, softened her voice, and allowed others to speak for her. These gestures, though small, distinguished her from Anne At a time when the court sought relief from conflict, the king interpreted her restraint as gentleness. Courtiers interpreted it as loyalty. Women interpreted it as caution. The mixture of these interpretations created an image of Jane that the court could accept without resistance. She did not challenge. She did not push. And she did not disrupt. This alone made her valuable in a system exhausted by disorder. Yet Jane's assent carried a shadow she could never escape. Her very presence served as a judgment against Anne, even if Jane did not intend harm. Her emergence as the king's preference confirmed that Anne's downfall was inevitable. Each step Jane took toward queenship deepened the cracks already forming around the previous queen. The court's shift toward Jane was not gentle. It was driven by the same fervour that had once elevated Anne. Now it turned that same intensity against her, using Jane's quietness as a tool to highlight Anne's perceived failings. Jane became the embodiment of the court's desire for correction, a living rebuke to the chaos that had grown around Anne's reign. Jane understood this contradiction, though she rarely spoke of it. Her eyes showed the awareness she could not voice, that her future depended on the destruction of another woman. Her modesty, though genuine, could not erase the weight of that truth. The court's silence around Anne's decline pressed heavily on Jane, reminding her that favour was not a reward, but a precarious inheritance. She walked carefully through the palace, aware that each gesture she made might be interpreted as triumph or as evidence that she had played a part in Anne's undoing. The court allowed no distinction between intention and consequence. As Anne's fall accelerated, Jane's position solidified. Women who had kept their distance began to approach her again, offering support in subtle ways. Small courtesies, steady attentiveness, careful respect. They were not drawn to Jane alone. They were drawn to the safety her future position promised. Their gestures revealed not affection but necessity. The court demanded alignment with the rising figure, and Jane now occupied that role. She did not resist it, but neither did she embrace it openly. Her quiet acceptance served as both shield and surrender. When Anne was removed, the weight of Jane's new role settled on her with a clarity that left little room for comfort. She stepped into queenship, not as a triumphant successor, but as the product of the court's merciless cycle. Her reign began on the foundation of someone else's ruin. The court celebrated her with the same eagerness it had once shown Anne. But beneath that celebration lay a lingering recognition that Jane's existence as queen did not resolve the instability of the court, but revealed its pattern more starkly. Jane's humility could not erase the knowledge that she stood where another woman had been torn apart. Her presence carried implications she did not choose, shaped by forces she could not control. Her crown was polished, but the shadow it cast remained long and unmistakable. Her quiet rise showed how the court could transform gentleness into a weapon, simply by directing it against someone already marked for destruction. As she stepped into the fragile space left behind, the tensions that had consumed Anne did not disappear. They merely shifted, preparing to take new forms around the woman now wearing the crown. The execution of Anne Boleyn left a silence in the Tudor court that felt heavier than the turmoil preceding it. It was not the silence of mourning, nor the silence of respect. It was the silence of fear settling into the routines of daily life. Women who had once moved through the palace with measured confidence now carried themselves with a guarded stillness, as if any gesture made too quickly might draw unwanted attention. The courtyard where Anne had taken her final steps lingered in their thoughts, a reminder that a queen's downfall could sweep away anyone standing too close to her. The spectacle of her death did not merely end a reign, it reshaped the emotional landscape of every woman who had witnessed the rise and collapse of her influence. Fear travelled quietly through the halls. It drifted between conversations, seeped into private chambers, and lingered even in the presence of the new queen. The court had seen a woman elevated, scrutinized, condemned, and destroyed within a span so brief that it unsettled the deepest assumptions about safety and status. No one fully understood how Anne's fate had unravelled with such speed. They only understood that it had, and that its consequences touched them all. Meetings between women became shorter. Exchanges that once held warmth now carried hesitation. The court's atmosphere pressed upon them with a coldness that warned against trust. The collapse of faith in personal bonds happened quietly. Women who had shared confidences, who had supported one another through the uncertainties of previous years, now weighed every word before speaking. The execution had shown that a woman's downfall could be used to implicate others, even if their involvement was no more than kindness or proximity. Loyalty had become dangerous. Even affection carried risk. The court did not need to forbid these things. The memory of the scaffold had already done the work. Women learned to guard their expressions, to conceal their thoughts, and to turn away from the impulse to comfort one another. The safest posture was neutrality, unreadable, unaligned, untouched by sentiment. This shift marked a profound change in the fabric of female relationships at court. The alliances that once helped women endure the demands of palace life now felt fragile, almost impossible to sustain. The court rewarded those who remained aloof, who kept their emotional distance, who avoided being pulled into the tide of a queen's fortunes. Anne's execution had made one truth unmistakable: no woman, regardless of charm or intelligence or influence, was beyond the reach of destruction. If a queen could fall, then any woman could. And if a queen's companions could be accused alongside her, then companionship itself became a liability. Women responded by protecting themselves in ways that reflected this new reality. Their movements grew more deliberate. Their words became shorter, sharper, or simply absent. They kept their eyes lowered, their conversations polite but empty, their alliances faint enough to dissolve the moment danger threatened. They learned to calculate not only their own position but the potential cost of being seen near someone whose standing might shift. Even moments of routine, handing a cloak to another woman, pausing to help steady a gown, offering a quiet comment, were reconsidered. The court had shown that it could twist even ordinary interactions into evidence. The death of Anne Boleyn also forced women to reassess their understanding of the king's power. His decisions had always shaped the court, but now his capacity for abrupt and total reversal became undeniable. His affections could transform into condemnation without warning. His will could erase titles, reputations, and lives with a speed that made the structure of court hierarchy feel less like a ladder and more like a cliff. Women learned to read his moods with greater care, adjusting their behavior to avoid attracting attention. Their safety no longer depended on their own actions alone. It depended on the shifting thoughts of a man who held absolute authority. For some women, this atmosphere fostered a continuous internal tension, a struggle between the need for support and the fear of vulnerability. They longed for connection in a world that demanded caution. Yet any attempt to form such bonds tightened the threat surrounding them. The court had become a place of constant restraint, where trust felt reckless, and honesty felt dangerous. Even shared grief for Anne's fate remained unspoken, trapped beneath layers of self-preservation. Others adapted with colder precision. They observed, withdrew, and waited. Their survival came from distance rather than connection. They understood that the court rewarded those who remained unaffected, those who showed no reaction to the fall of another. They built their safety not on alliances but on absence. Absence of opinion, absence of attachment, absence of risk. This emotional retreat did not make them stronger, it made them less visible, which in the Tudor court could be the difference between endurance and collapse. In the months after Anne's death, the court regained its outward rhythm. Ceremonies resumed, duties continued, and Jane Seymour settled into her role as queen. Yet beneath that outward normalcy, the women carried the memory of how swiftly the ground beneath them could vanish. They moved through the palace as though walking across thin ice, aware that every step must be measured with care. Anne's execution had revealed the truth they had long suspected, but never fully confronted, that they lived in a world where survival might require abandoning not only loyalty, but also the hope of genuine connection. The silence that followed Anne's death revealed how deeply fear had seeped into the court's foundations. As trust dissolved and caution took hold, the women learned to guard themselves against dangers they could not name. Out of that spreading unease emerged a new way of navigating court life. One shaped entirely by the need to remain untouched by the fate that had claimed a queen. Catherine Howard entered the Tudor court with the brightness of youth still untempered by experience. Her steps light, her expressions open, her presence carrying none of the guarded restraint that shaped the women around her. She arrived too young to understand the weight of the rooms she walked into, too hopeful to sense the dangers hidden beneath the court's polished surfaces. The women who watched her recognized this innocence immediately. Some felt a flicker of sympathy, others felt an uneasy awareness of how quickly innocence could be consumed here. Catherine did not yet know that she was stepping into a world where even seasoned women struggled to survive, and where a lack of allies could mark the beginning of an inevitable collapse. Her youth, which might have been a source of admiration in another setting, became a quiet vulnerability in this one. She entered the court at a moment when fear still lingered from the death of Anne Boleyn, and caution defined every gesture made by the women who served near the throne. These women had learned through loss, isolation, and betrayal that offering support to a rising figure could be dangerous, especially when that figure carried the king's favour. Catherine's ascent drew attention quickly, but it did not draw protection. Those who might have guided her kept their distance, unwilling to endanger themselves by standing too close to someone inexperienced enough to make mistakes the court would not forgive. Catherine sensed the isolation but could not interpret it. She mistook polite distance for formality, reserved expressions for indifference, and quiet avoidance for the natural stiffness of court life. She had not seen how women once gathered around Catherine of Aragon, or how cautiously they had shifted away from Anne Boleyn. She lacked the history needed to read the signs, and so she moved without awareness into a system that demanded constant interpretation. Her eagerness, her openness, and her unguarded warmth placed her at odds with an environment shaped by hidden fears and unspoken calculations. Without women to advise her, Catherine navigated the court as though it was still capable of sincerity. She believed gestures meant what they appeared to mean, that duties were as straightforward as they seemed, and that affection offered by the king could shield her from danger. Her naivety was not childish. It was simply unprotected by the layers of experience that other queens had worn like armor. She interpreted the court as a place where kindness might still be possible, unaware that others viewed her through the lens of risk. Risk to themselves, risk to their households, risk to their standing. The women who served near her watched her attempts to settle into her role with a quiet discomfort. They had lived through too many power shifts to attach themselves to a queen whose position appeared unstable even in its earliest stages. Catherine, lacking the political instincts of her predecessors, who did not understand how quickly favour could shift, or how deeply her actions would be interpreted by those hoping to anticipate the king's desires. She underestimated the court's hunger for stories, the machinery that turned small rumours into accusations, and the readiness with which it consumed women who failed to navigate its expectations. Her isolation created a void that the court filled with speculation, even harmless gestures, laughter in a hallway, a misplaced word, a moment of unfiltered joy, became material for whispers. Without older, more seasoned women to correct her steps or guide her reactions, Catherine moved through the palace as though its dangers were distant. The court interpreted this as carelessness. In truth, it was simply the absence of protection. The women who might once have intervened had already been taught by the past that intervention could cost them more than silence ever would. The king's favour intensified Catherine's vulnerability. His attention drew her into the centre of court life, but it did not shield her from scrutiny. Each woman who approached her weighed the potential risks of being associated with someone who lacked the experience to manage her own position. Their distance grew not from malice, but from fear. They had seen what happened to those who stood too close to queens who fell. Catherine did not yet understand that isolation itself was a warning, one she had neither the knowledge nor the allies to interpret. As time passed, the gaps between Catherine and the women of the court widened. She felt the absence of companionship, but lacked the tools to rebuild it. Her attempts to create warmth were met with polite restraint. Her gestures of familiarity received with guarded courtesy. She stood, surrounded by people, yet remained profoundly alone. The court, trained by past tragedies, refused to involve itself in another queen's uncertain trajectory. Every woman carried memories of those who had been swept away by accusations or silenced by association. Catherine's youth made her unpredictable, and unpredictability made her unsafe. The tragedy of Catherine Howard lay not solely in her mistakes, but in the absence of a structure that might have guided her away from them. She became queen without the shield of seasoned allies, without the caution learned through long years of survival, and without the understanding that the court demanded vigilance from the moment she stepped into power. She stood on ground already cracked by history, surrounded by women who had learned to protect themselves first and one another second. Her early isolation revealed how thoroughly the court had dismantled the bonds that once offered women a measure of safety. As she moved forward without guidance or defense, the dangers she could not see gathered quietly around her. From that unprotected beginning, the unraveling of her fate had already begun to take shape. Silence settled across the Tudor court, with a weight that felt heavier than the clamour of any political upheaval. When women no longer reached toward one another, when shared glances held caution instead of recognition, the palace itself seemed to tighten around them. Each corridor, each chamber, each ceremony took on a new stillness, shaped by fear rather than formality. Bonds that had once offered even the faintest protection had dissolved under the pressure of past executions, leaving every woman exposed to the full scrutiny of a system that thrived on their separation. Without the shelter of collective defense, they became easier to watch, easier to judge, and far easier to destroy. Life within these walls began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Women adjusted their behavior with an attentiveness born not of courtesy but of survival. A greeting became shorter. A pause in conversation grew longer. Expressions were flattened into neutrality to avoid revealing anything that might be misinterpreted. The court had taught them repeatedly that even small gestures could be reshaped into accusations when no one was willing to step forward and counter them. Beneath their composed appearances, they measured every movement with the care of someone navigating a floor riddled with unseen cracks. Exaggeration became the court's preferred weapon once support systems vanished. A misplaced word could swell into suspicion. A misunderstood look became the beginning of a rumor. Actions, stripped of context, were allowed to gain momentum until they served the court's desire for tension or the ambitions of individuals seeking favor. Women found themselves forced to defend not only their choices, but the interpretations others assigned to them, without allies to intervene, without someone to say, "This is not what it seems." Each woman faced the court's scrutiny alone. The process of distortion operated smoothly precisely because no one resisted it. Fear intensified the ease with which these distortions took hold. Long before formal accusations emerged, women sensed shifts in the air, conversations that quieted when they approached, glances that lasted a fraction too long, spaces where they once felt welcome now narrowing around them. Their vulnerability grew, not because they acted recklessly, but because the court had mastered the art of isolating its subjects. A woman could be guilty of nothing beyond misjudging her own visibility. Yet that alone might be enough to place her in danger. The scaffold had already shown how rapidly accusations could turn into sentences. Each downfall reinforced the idea that survival depended on self-preservation above all else. Acts of compassion became rare, for compassion required closeness, and closeness carried risk. Women who once supported one another now watched from a deliberate distance. Their restraint was not unkindness, It was recognition of a reality that punished loyalty more severely than betrayal. The court rewarded those who stayed quiet, who avoided entanglement, who allowed the system to function without interference. In such an environment, unity was not simply discouraged, it became impossible. This fragmentation served royal power without conscious effort. A divided group posed no threat. A woman stripped of allies could be removed with little resistance. Her fall did not disrupt the balance of the court because the court had engineered itself to withstand such losses. It did not need to explain its decisions when no collective voice questioned them. Authority flowed unchallenged through the halls precisely because it had dismantled every network that might have softened its reach. Each isolated figure stood at the mercy of an institution that recognized the usefulness of fear. Even mundane routines revealed this shift. Women performed their roles with muted precision, rarely lingering, rarely engaging beyond what protocol required. Their faces revealed nothing, their voices carried only what was necessary. The absence of casual conversation, of shared observations, of whispered reassurances marked the depth of their withdrawal. They lived beside one another, yet remained emotionally distant, each guarding her thoughts in the hope that secrecy might offer protection. This solitude made them less resilient, less capable of sensing danger until it was too late. Rumors thrived in this environment because silence offered no resistance. A whisper could slide easily through rooms, gaining shape as it traveled. Those who heard it responded not with skepticism but with compliance, unwilling to risk contradicting a narrative that seemed to carry official approval. Women became both objects and tools of this circulation, implicated by stories that grew heavier with each retelling. Without a community willing to question or intervene, the machinery of rumor operated as efficiently as any formal accusation. Death remained the ultimate expression of the court's authority. A beheading did not simply remove an individual, it reinforced the consequences of standing alone. Each execution reminded the women that a single misinterpreted action could become a final judgment when no one stepped forward to soften the blow. In this way, the absence of solidarity amplified the power of the crown more effectively than any decree could. The court did not need to demand obedience. Fear itself ensured compliance. Over time, isolation became the expected posture for a woman of the Tudor court. She survived not by forging alliances but by avoiding them. She remained visible enough to fulfill her duties, yet invisible enough to escape attention. Her silence became both her shield and her undoing. The system did not need to crush her directly. It only needed to ensure she had no one to hold on to when the ground beneath her shifted. This fractured world showed how thoroughly fear had reshaped the lives around the throne, leaving each woman exposed to dangers enlarged by silence. As caution hardened into distance and rumors gained strength, the court found new ways to tighten its grip. Out of that widening gulf between them, the next struggle began to take form, waiting for another life to slip into its reach. Competition within the Tudor court did not announce itself with open conflict or raised voices. It developed slowly, almost imperceptibly, within the routines that structured daily life. Women moved through the palace, carrying out familiar tasks. Yet beneath the surface of these duties ran quiet divisions that shaped how each interaction unfolded. No one publicly acknowledged these lines, but they existed nonetheless, drawn by the shifting tides of favor and the memory of past downfalls. Servants and noblewomen alike learned that neutrality was rarely an option. Allegiances formed not out of loyalty, but out of necessity, binding women to individuals or households in ways that often restricted their movements and narrowed their choices. Choosing a faction did not always involve explicit commitment. Sometimes it happened through small, seemingly insignificant decisions, standing beside one woman instead of another during a ceremony, repeating a detail overheard in passing, offering help at a moment when someone else failed to. These actions, observed by watchful eyes, placed women within invisible networks that shaped their futures. Refusal to align was interpreted as resistance, and resistance carried its own risks. The court thrived on clarity, even if that clarity was artificial. A woman without a faction appeared unpredictable, and unpredictability stirred unease. Aligning oneself was not a declaration of loyalty, but an act of survival. Rumors moved through this fractured structure with ease. They did not require proof, intention, or context. They required only that someone found them useful. A whispered comment could gain traction simply because it benefited one circle of women over another. Servants repeated what they heard to secure their positions. Noble women shaped stories to protect their households. Even small misinterpretations became amplified when filtered through the motives of multiple groups. In such an environment, truth became secondary to function. What mattered was which version of a story held enough momentum to drift toward the king's attention, or to stop just short of it. These rumors were not merely tools for undermining rivals. They were tests of loyalty. A woman's reaction to a story offered more information than the story itself. Hesitation signaled uncertainty. Defensiveness suggested attachment. Silence revealed calculation. Every response was observed and weighed, shaping the unspoken alliances that governed interactions. Women learned quickly that the safest path often involved accepting the rumor without confirming or denying it. Outward neutrality concealed an inward strategy. Words spoken too boldly might bind a woman to the fate of another, and the court had shown repeatedly how dangerous such bonds could become. Friendship began to erode under the pressure of this environment. Women who had once found comfort in shared confidences now avoided closeness, aware that emotional ties could be exploited by rivals or interpreted as conspiratorial. A simple conversation behind a closed door could invite suspicion, especially if one woman in the pair carried even a whisper of controversy. The safer choice was distance, measured, polite, and guarded. Invitations grew selective. Secrets became burdens instead of bonds. Support is offered in private, risk exposure in public. What resembled coldness was, in truth, a method of self-preservation learned through observation of past tragedies. The court's architecture reinforced these divisions. Its narrow corridors encouraged hushed exchanges. Its grand halls provided space for strategic visibility. Its private chambers offered opportunities for manipulation. Every part of the palace played a role in shaping how information moved. Women who navigated these spaces understood that physical proximity often translated into political meaning. Standing too close to someone could imply an alliance. Avoiding them too pointedly could imply opposition. The constant pressure of appearances made sincerity rare and vulnerability nearly impossible. Younger women faced the greatest difficulties. They entered the court without knowledge of these unwritten rules, often lingering near peers or gravitating toward those who seemed welcoming. Their gestures, innocent in intention, sometimes placed them within a faction they had no desire to join, or positioned them against women they barely understood. Older women watched these missteps with a mixture of sympathy and resignation, knowing that the court would draw its own conclusions long before the inexperienced realized the implications. Few intervened. Helping someone navigate these divisions risked drawing unwanted attention to oneself. The court's ability to sustain this competition depended on constant uncertainty. No faction held power securely. Alliances shifted with every rumor. Every small change in the king's mood. Every fall or rise of a favored figure. Women lived in anticipation of the next movement, adjusting their behavior with the precision of someone navigating a landscape that changed without warning. Competition became a background noise. Never loud, never chaotic, but pervasive. It shaped how women spoke, how they moved, how they interacted, and how they interpreted silence. Even those who attempted to remain uninvolved found themselves pulled into the dynamics simply by existing within the palace. A gesture misread could be enough to spark a narrative. A rumor reaching one's ears could require a response. A failure to respond could be twisted into complicity. The court offered no escape from participation. even when that participation consisted of trying to avoid being noticed. Women learned that neutrality required as much effort as alliance, and that both carried consequences. This subtle yet relentless form of competition ensured that the court remained fragmented. A unified group might have softened the impact of royal authority or resisted the destructive cycles that had consumed previous queens. Instead, the women moved independently, shaped by fear, ambition, or simple caution. Their separation allowed the court's machinery to function without obstruction, processing lives with a precision made possible by their inability to stand together. These quiet rivalries revealed how the palace shaped women into separate forces moving in parallel, each wary of becoming entangled in another's fate. As rumors spread and alliances shifted, daily life grew more precarious, narrowing the space in which any woman could move safely. In that constant tension, new divisions waited to deepen, ready to redraw the lines of survival once again. Catherine Howard and Anne of Cleves occupied the same court, yet lived entirely different versions of survival. Their paths never mirrored one another, and the contrast between them revealed how deeply the Tudor palace depended on a woman's ability to understand its unseen structures. Both entered the royal world under the gaze of a king whose favour shaped their futures. But only one recognized the nature of the system early enough to protect herself. The other, guided by youth and unsteady counsel, stepped into a landscape she could not interpret. Their fates were not defined by character alone, but by their proximity to danger and their awareness, or lack of awareness, of the rules governing every breath taken in the palace. Anne of Cleves arrived armed with neither beauty nor charm, as judged by courtly standards. But she brought something far more valuable, an instinct for retreat. Her marriage to the king grew strained from the beginning. Yet she quickly sensed the contours of the threat surrounding her. When it became clear that her position was untenable, she did not attempt to resist or reclaim what she had theoretically been granted. Instead, she ceded the title willingly, stepping away from queenship and accepting the role of the king's sister. This decision, which others might have perceived as humiliation, secured her safety with remarkable efficiency. She gained independence, a household, a steady income, and the king's continued favour, not out of affection, but out of relief that she posed no challenge. Her survival depended on her refusal to engage in competition. She did not fight for power, did not seek influence, and did not allow others to draw her into their ambitions. By stepping aside, she removed herself from the dangerous centre of the royal circle, where attention could shift into suspicion without warning. She recognized that a queen who no longer wished to be queen was of no threat to anyone. The court had no reason to weaponize her existence. Her compliance did not signal weakness, but strategic understanding. She observed what had happened to other women and adapted. This ability to interpret the court's intentions allowed her to avoid the consequences that had claimed so many before her. Catherine Howard, by contrast, entered the palace with none of the caution that guarded Anne's steps. Her youth and inexperience made her an easy figure to lift upward and an even easier one to tear down. She had no history with the court, no familiarity with its hidden traps, and no one to explain the risks embedded within every choice she made. Even her ascent to queenship resulted less from her own ambition than from the desires and calculations of those around her. Once elevated, she found herself at the centre of attention she did not know how to manage. The palace watched her with the same hunger it had once directed toward Anne Boleyn, ready to either adore or condemn her, depending on which direction the king's affection turned. Catherine did not understand the politics of visibility. She believed that warmth, affection, and joy could exist openly in an environment that rewarded restraint. Her gestures, simple acts of friendliness, small attempts at pleasure, were interpreted not as innocence, but as signs of impropriety. Women who might once have protected her kept their distance, unwilling to align themselves with someone whose lack of caution threatened to draw danger to everyone near her. Without allies, she could not counter the narratives forming around her. Without guidance, she could not distinguish between harmless behaviors and actions the court would magnify into threats. Her downfall emerged slowly at first. Then, with sharp acceleration, once suspicion gained momentum, the court did not require direct evidence to build a case. It needed only the absence of a defense. Catherine had no one to speak for her. No one to redirect attention. No one to cushion the interpretations of her actions. The system that had allowed Anne of Cleves to step aside now tightened its grip around Catherine, whose youth made her vulnerable to missteps that others could weaponize. Each rumour, each accusation, each recalled detail from her past became part of a narrative she had no power to reshape. The court's judgment was swift, and its sentence final. The difference between their fates lay not in the moral worth of either woman, but in their relationships to the rules governing the palace. Anne of Cleves understood that the safest position was not at the centre of power, but outside its direct reach. Catherine, lacking this understanding, became caught in the machinery she could not see. Where Anne withdrew, Catherine remained exposed. Where Anne avoided attention, Catherine attracted it without intending to. Where Anne recognized the value of surrender, Catherine believed she could exist without learning the court's methods of survival. Their stories revealed the extent to which the palace demanded not only obedience but insight. A woman needed to read its silences, to anticipate its changes, and recognize when retreat offered more safety than victory. One woman lived because she saw these truths early. The other died because no one taught her to see them at all. These two lives illustrated how survival in the Tudor court depended less on virtue than on perception, shaping one woman into a figure who endured through withdrawal, while leaving another exposed to dangers she never recognized. As their stories diverged, the palace revealed yet again how selectively it preserved those who understood its quiet demands. Through that stark divide, the next shift in the court's fragile balance began to gather its force. Anne of Cleves entered the Tudor court under circumstances shaped more by diplomacy than desire. Her marriage to the king, arranged as a gesture of alliance rather than affection. From the moment she arrived, she sensed a tension beneath the formal greetings, a quiet scrutiny, an expectation that she would adapt quickly to customs she had never encountered. Her unfamiliarity with the court's social rhythms made her an easy target for observation. Yet she did not react with defiance or eagerness. Instead, she watched. She absorbed the silence between compliments, the hesitation in certain gestures, the faint discomfort in the king's expression. These details, though subtle, revealed more to her than open criticism ever could. They told her that her position was already unstable. Understanding this allowed her to make the choice that would ultimately save her life. When the king's dissatisfaction became undeniable, Anne did not cling to the title she had been given. She recognized that insisting on the dignity of queenship would place her directly in the path of forces she could not control, forces that had destroyed other women before her. Instead of resisting, she stepped aside with a calm acceptance that disarmed both her critics and her observers. The decision to relinquish her crown was not born of weakness. It was an act of clarity, a recognition that survival required relinquishing power rather than asserting it. Her withdrawal reshaped her place within the court. Freed from the expectations placed upon a queen, she navigated the palace with a measured quietness that kept her beyond the reach of danger. Women who had once regarded her with caution now approached her with greater ease. Her lack of ambition removed any sense of competition, transforming her into a figure who posed no threat to anyone's standing. Without the intensity that surrounded queenship, interactions with Anne felt safer. She became a person whom others could acknowledge without risk, whose presence did not stir jealousy or suspicion. Anne understood the value of this neutrality. She did not attempt to reclaim influence or cultivate favor. She did not seek to involve herself in disputes or courtly games. Her conversations remained polite but deliberate, offering warmth without entanglement. Women appreciated this restraint. They had lived through the sharp divisions created by previous queens and recognized the comfort of interacting with someone who demanded nothing from them. Anne's manner invited neither loyalty nor rivalry. It created a space where civility could exist without consequence. Despite her lack of official power, Anne carried a quiet authority. She became known for her composure, her understanding of boundaries, and her ability to navigate the court without drawing conflict toward herself. Her withdrawal from queenship earned her a rare form of stability. The king, relieved by her compliance, granted her generous settlements and continued to treat her with public respect. This unusual arrangement placed her in a position few women in the Tudor court ever achieved. She remained protected without being exposed to the dangers that accompanied influence. Her survival stemmed not only from her choices, but from her grasp of the palace's deeper structure. She understood that competing for prominence would invite scrutiny, and that scrutiny often led to destruction. She recognized that alliances formed too quickly could become liabilities, and that emotional investment in courtly life could leave one vulnerable to shifts in favor. The court rewarded those who mastered subtlety, and Anne embraced that lesson with unembellished precision. She cultivated no enemies because she cultivated no ambition. This restraint, though effective, required constant awareness. Anne did not interpret her safety as permanent. She observed the fates of other women and understood how quickly circumstances could change. Her calm demeanor was not a sign of naive trust, but of consistent vigilance. She maintained her position by avoiding any association that might draw her back into political tension. Her life became a balance between presence and distance, visible enough to reassure the king of her goodwill, yet reserved enough to avoid being mistaken for a political actor. Other women took note of her strategy. Some admired it, others viewed it as a form of surrender. But beneath these interpretations lay a simple truth. Anne survived because she refused to participate in a system designed to manipulate and consume those who reached for power. Her refusal to compete preserved her life in a court where competing had destroyed others. She became a reminder that safety did not always belong to those who held influence. Often, it belonged to those who stepped aside before the machinery could tighten around them. Even as queens rose and fell after she departed from the throne, Anne remained steady. She watched transitions with an understanding shaped by her own experience. She knew that each woman stepping into the role faced expectations she herself had escaped. She understood that being queen meant entering a place where admiration could transform into condemnation with little warning. Her distance allowed her to maintain empathy without absorbing the danger. She existed within the court yet remained untouched by its sharpest edges. Her quiet decision to withdraw revealed how survival could take the form of deliberate absence rather than the pursuit of power, allowing her to endure while others faced peril. As she moved through the palace with measured calm, the contrast between her stability and the turbulence around her deepened, signaling that the court would soon confront another shift shaped by far less willing participants. Proximity to the Tudor throne carried a weight that few understood until it settled upon them. From a distance, power looked orderly, polished, and steady, an anchor around which court life revolved. Yet for those who stepped too close, its glow concealed an intensity that stripped away comfort, caution, and even identity. Women who approached the center of authority felt this pressure before anyone else, as if the air around the king thinned with competition and expectation. They discovered, often too late, that the throne did not reward strength alone. It demanded surrender, vigilance, and an ability to survive under scrutiny so sharp it could unravel a life in a single moment. Losing near the crown was not a sign of weakness. It was a consequence of standing where no one could safely remain. What defined these women was not their failure, but the court's hunger for someone to bear the cost of its shifting loyalties. Those favoured by the king found themselves in a position both coveted and feared. Their names circulated through the palace before their own voices did. Their gestures were recorded, repeated, and reshaped by observers eager to predict how the king's attention might change. Admiration became a trap, tying them to a gaze they could not escape. Every smile, every silence, every hesitation carried the potential to signal a fault. Power offered visibility, and visibility invited danger. Friendship did not survive at this height. Women near the crown learned that affection could not withstand the pressure of the king's shifting moods. The intimacy that might have eased the weight of expectation fractured under the strain of strategic necessity. At court, closeness created vulnerability. For anyone who approached too near might become implicated in another's fall. Loyalty became selective, calculated, and temporary. Women guarded their thoughts, understanding that even a moment of misplaced sympathy could be interpreted as alignment with someone already losing favor. This isolation was not chosen, it was imposed by the structure surrounding them. The court's demands pressed inward until personal identity dissolved into performance. A woman who stood near the center of power could not simply be herself. She had to become what others needed her to be. Her expressions were measured, her tone adjusted, her presence calibrated to satisfy expectations that shifted without warning. The crown reflected pressure outward, shaping the lives of those around it through its constant hunger for assurance. In this environment, misreading a gesture or misjudging a silence could result in consequences far beyond correction. It could mean removal, disgrace, or death. Power created an illusion of stability. Women believed, at least briefly, that closeness to the king granted protection. It was easy to assume that the warmth of his favor extended into every corner of court life. Yet the opposite proved true. The nearer one stood, the more precarious each moment became. Those outside the inner circle carried risks, but those within it carried the weight of being watched by everyone. Friends, rivals, servants, and advisors. Their downfall, should it come, would be not only public but swift. As if the court needed to re-establish its balance by removing the woman whose presence disturbed it. This was why calculation replaced trust. At the heart of Tudor politics, intentions mattered less than outcomes, and outcomes were often decided by interpretations beyond any woman's control. The quieter ambitions, survival, stability, and peace, were often overshadowed by the court's insistence on reading meaning into every action. Women who navigated this sphere learned to think several steps ahead, anticipating how their choices might be seen rather than how they felt. They existed inside a structure where even genuine humility could be mistaken for manipulation, and where hesitation could be seen as guilt. Loss near the center was amplified by the isolation that surrounded it. A woman who fell from favor rarely had the support needed to steady herself. Those who once offered smiles now avoided her gaze. Those who had stood beside her stepped back, unwilling to be associated with a figure whose trajectory threatened their own safety. The same court that had once elevated her would watch silently as she unraveled, its members distancing themselves with the precision of people who understood the cost of compassion. The court did not punish malice. It punished nearness. Women who recognized this dynamic early learned to hold themselves at the edges of power. They observed how favor turned to suspicion, how admiration hardened into resentment, how closeness made even the smallest misstep fatal. Their restraint was not cowardice, but survival. Remaining slightly removed from the king's inner world allowed them room to breathe, to observe, to adjust without bearing the full weight of the throne's demands. They survived not by being stronger, but by refusing to stand anywhere that required constant defense. Others thrust toward the center without preparation or warning, faced a fate shaped by forces beyond their understanding. Their intentions, no matter how gentle or sincere, could not shield them from the danger of being too visible. The crown magnified everything around it, turning ordinary actions into judgments. These women were not undone by weakness, but by proximity. Proximity to a seat of power that consumed those it illuminated too intensely. This stark reality showed how closeness to authority became a source of peril, stripping away the comforts of trust and replacing them with relentless caution. As isolation deepened and calculation overtook genuine connection, the court prepared to test its next subject, shaping another life around the dangerous glow of royal attention. Catherine Parr entered the Tudor court with an awareness that set her apart from the women who had come before her. She had watched the rise and fall of queens with a clarity that came only from distance, and she understood how easily affection turned into accusation, how quickly admiration became suspicion. Nothing about the throne looked safe to her. Nothing about the king's favour felt secure. Yet when she became his wife, she carried into the palace a steadiness that did not challenge the system outright, but moved through it with deliberate restraint. Her survival did not depend on silence alone. It depended on recognizing the patterns that had destroyed others and shaping her life around the gaps where danger might settle. Alliances became the foundation of her approach. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who had gathered fervour that quickly turned volatile, or Catherine Howard, who never understood the need for protection, Catherine Parr built her network quietly, with measured precision. She aligned herself not with a single faction, but with a series of individuals whose support was shaped by mutual caution rather than ambition. Her connections extended across households, through women of various ranks. Each alliance subtle enough to escape scrutiny, yet strong enough to provide insulation when tension rose. These ties did not display loyalty through grand gestures. They offered stability through shared interest in survival. Catherine understood that the court devoured isolated women. She intended never to stand alone. Her caution shaped every word she spoke. Conversations in the Tudor court never unfolded without consequences. She had seen how one misplaced phrase could become a weapon in someone else's hands. Catherine measured her tone carefully, choosing language that conveyed thought without inviting challenge. She avoided open criticism, even when approached by those eager to draw her into disputes. She offered kindness without making promises, and curiosity without exposing judgment. This deliberate restraint allowed her to remain present without being implicated in conflicts that shifted unpredictably. Her caution was not fear, it was preparation, built on the memory of women who had been punished for speaking too boldly or too freely. Even her interactions with the king reflected this understanding. She knew he valued intelligence, but she also knew he demanded deference. Catherine learned to balance both, offering thoughtful discussion while never pressing beyond what he welcomed. Her knowledge became a resource rather than a threat. She read widely, wrote with clarity, and participated in theological debate. Yet she did so with a discipline that framed her intelligence as supportive rather than confrontational. She understood that the court interpreted assertiveness in women as rebellion, and rebellion, whether real or imagined, had already cost others their lives. Her reliance on learning gave her a form of protection that differed from the strategies of previous queens. Education shaped her thinking, allowing her to anticipate reactions, interpret silences, and navigate the subtleties that governed court life. She watched how people shifted their expressions when uncertain, how they paused before agreeing, how their eyes moved when assessing risk. These details allowed her to sense when danger approached. Knowledge sharpened her awareness, turning caution into foresight, while other queens had been undone by the court's ability to reshape their stories. Catherine Parr used understanding to prevent such stories from taking hold. Her alliances deepened as she earned the respect of those around her. Women gravitated toward her, not because she sought leadership, but because she offered steadiness in an environment defined by volatility. She provided support without drawing attention, advice without claiming authority, and reassurance without creating dependence. These gestures created a protective circle that did not resemble the factions driven by rivalry. Instead, it formed a quiet network of women who saw in Catherine a figure capable of offering guidance without risking their safety. Her influence did not provoke competition because it did not seek to dominate. It served to stabilize. Yet Catherine never mistook this stability for immunity. She had observed too many abrupt reversals to believe the court would spare her if suspicion grew. Her alliances, however carefully formed, could dissolve under pressure. Her caution, however constant, could be misinterpreted. She navigated each day with a recognition that survival required ongoing vigilance. Safety was not a condition to be achieved. It was a balance to be maintained. This understanding prevented her from becoming complacent. Even as she gained a reputation for wisdom and restraint, the pressures around her were real. Even if she carried them quietly, she lived with the knowledge that the king's temper could shift, that advisors could manipulate perception, and that her intelligence, if displayed too boldly, could be read as audacity. Catherine threaded her life between these possibilities with a discipline shaped by memory. Memory of women who had spoken too freely, who had trusted too easily, who had stood too near the throne without understanding its cost. Her strategy was neither submissive nor rebellious. It was adaptive. Her endurance reflected not just her intellect but her ability to interpret the environment with unblinking clarity. She recognized that survival depended on understanding both the spoken rules and the unspoken demands. And she responded with a balance that few others managed. Catherine Parr's life at court did not avoid danger, it anticipated it, shifting its weight before the ground could give way beneath her. Her careful alliances and measured restraint showed how knowledge could serve as armor in a world shaped by suspicion. While she moved through the palace with deliberate composure, the echoes of past tragedies shaped her every step, signaling that her steadiness would soon be tested in ways that revealed the limits of even the most disciplined survival. Women of the Tudor court entered its final years with a guardedness that had not existed in earlier reigns. Time had reshaped them, pressing experience into their behavior until even the smallest movements reflected a deep awareness of danger. They no longer relied on the idea that honesty or sincerity could protect them. Too many examples proved otherwise. Instead, they approached each day with the understanding that trust had become a luxury none of them could afford. Their composure was not a natural temperament, but a discipline forged through witnessing the destruction of those who had once believed the court might allow space for genuine connection. By the end of Henry VIII's rule, caution had become the language through which women communicated their intentions to one another. Expressions grew restrained, their warmth trimmed away until only the necessary sentiments remained. Women who once might have exchanged confidences now offered only polite distance. They understood that vulnerability did not simply expose emotion, it exposed risk. Even the hint of personal feeling could be misread by observers who viewed every gesture as a potential signal of alliance, defiance, or ambition. By suppressing emotion, women attempted to avoid becoming points of interest in an environment that watched them too closely. Their restraint created a uniform surface that concealed individual fear beneath layers of composure. Because emotions were suppressed, relationships shifted into forms defined more by strategy than by sympathy. A woman might choose companionship not for comfort, but for proximity to someone whose stability could protect her. Friendships that once carried warmth now resembled contracts. Oh, silent, conditional, and contingent on the shifting boundaries of safety. These connections could dissolve without explanation, the moment danger emerged. No one questioned such withdrawals. The court had taught them that survival often required retreat from those who had grown too visible or too vulnerable. Women navigated these strategic relationships with precision. They learned to evaluate others not by affection but by utility, who could offer protection, who might attract dangerous attention, who seemed on the verge of falling out of favor. Their awareness sharpened through repeated exposure to the court's instability. They did not act out of cruelty, but out of necessity. When alliances formed, they existed quietly, almost invisibly, functioning as subtle arrangements of mutual benefit rather than declarations of unity. These bonds were not meant to endure. They were meant to preserve. The court deepened these changes by encouraging competition without naming it. Each new queen brought a new configuration of influence, and with it, a new pattern of caution. Women adjusted quickly, reshaping their behavior to avoid being drawn into conflicts they neither initiated nor desired. They recognized that the court rewarded those who adapted and punished those who hesitated. Adaptation required emotional narrowing, reducing one's inner life to something unexpressed, contained, and invisible. This invisibility became a protective measure, a way of slipping beneath the court's restless search for someone to scrutinize. By the later years, even the younger women who entered the palace sensed the weight of this transformation. They watched older women move with deliberate stillness, offering few reactions, speaking with careful moderation. They saw how these habits shaped survival, and they learned to imitate them. Freshness and enthusiasm were tempered quickly. A young woman's gestures softened, her voice quieted, her expectations narrowed until she carried herself like those who had lived through the worst of the court storms. The environment demanded conformity to a pattern of self-erasure, and most complied. This emotional compression changed the atmosphere of the palace. Rooms that once held conversation now held silence. Walkways, once marked by quick exchanges, became spaces of solitary movement. Women crossed paths without acknowledging more than a brief nod. They did not do this out of coldness, but out of fear that deeper engagement could lead to entanglements with unpredictable consequences. Their behavior was less a reflection of personality than of the culture pressing in on them. The palace had become a place where danger spoke quietly, through glances and absences rather than through direct action. What remained beneath this restraint was a private longing rarely expressed, the desire for safety, stability, and the ability to trust without consequence. Yet the court's history had revealed that emotional openness risked exposure, and exposure risked accusation. Women learned to silence this longing, pushing it inward until even they rarely acknowledged it. Their inner lives became separate from their public selves, divided by necessity. This division allowed them to endure, but did not allow them to feel secure. Even gestures of kindness were filtered through caution. A woman offering help did so with measured neutrality, ensuring her actions could not be misread as allegiance. A sympathetic glance was brief enough to dissolve before anyone could assign meaning to it. Support, when offered, took the form of small, almost imperceptible acts designed to protect the giver as much as the recipient. The court had transformed compassion into something dangerous, and women adjusted by stripping it of expression while leaving a muted version of it intact beneath the surface. This gradual transformation did not eliminate the presence of emotion in the court. It concealed it. Fear persisted, shaping choices. Grief lingered in private moments, as women recalled those who had fallen. Hope survived in faint, guarded forms. But none of these feelings reached the surface where others could see them. The palace demanded outward calm, and women complied because refusal meant vulnerability. These muted changes revealed how thoroughly the court had reshaped its inhabitants, pushing them into patterns of silence and strategic distance. While trust faded and emotion narrowed into guarded restraint, each woman learned to navigate the palace by concealing the very qualities that once defined her. Through this tightening world, a new form of survival emerged, one shaped less by connection than by endurance. Relationships within the Tudor court seldom ended with confrontation or clarity. They dissolved slowly, almost imperceptibly, until nothing recognizable remained. Women who once shared confidences, exchanged small comforts, or found brief moments of solidarity discovered, over time, that the court required distance more than connection. Each friendship carried the weight of risk, and risk, when magnified by proximity to power, became an element no one could ignore. So ties loosened not through betrayal of intent, but through the steady pressure of survival. Silence grew where conversation once lived, creating an emptiness that neither woman acknowledged. as if naming it might expose them to danger. The absence of farewells marked these dissolutions. A woman did not look another in the eye and announce that their trust must end. Instead, she stepped back gradually, allowing interactions to become infrequent, then formal, then non-existent. This retreat often appeared polite to outsiders, even reasonable. But beneath its calm surface lay the quiet acceptance that closeness was no longer safe. The court trained its inhabitants to understand such shifts without explanation. No one questioned them. No one asked for justification. They recognized the pattern as part of court life. A pattern as familiar as the movement of attendants or the echo of footsteps in the corridors. As connections thinned, women adapted their behavior with practiced restraint. They avoided lingering near those who had fallen out of favor, even if these were the same women who once offered companionship. They reduced their presence in shared spaces, adjusting routines to prevent unwelcome association. These choices did not stem from cruelty. They stemmed from the logic that survival demanded minimal entanglement with instability. In this world, visibility mattered, and association could mark someone as vulnerable by proximity. So women withdrew, stepping aside long before danger became undeniable. For those who experienced the withdrawal, the change often arrived quietly. A familiar greeting became shorter. A shared glance no longer carried recognition. Conversations that once contained warmth now held only the tone of formality expected among strangers. Over time, these small alterations accumulated until the original relationship disappeared without leaving behind a moment of rupture or a single point of blame. The dissolution felt less like a breaking and more like a fading. Slow, inevitably, and unspoken. This quiet erasure mirrored the larger atmosphere of the court, where nothing ended directly unless forced by scandal or execution. The palace itself reinforced this manner of disengagement. Its architecture encouraged separation, with private chambers and enclosed corridors that allowed women to move without crossing paths. The structure of daily duties provided plausible reasons to avoid certain interactions. Changes in proximity were concealed by changes in schedule, allowing the emotional distances to grow without attracting attention. The environment did not simply host these dissolutions, it facilitated them, shaping each withdrawal through its physical and social design. Women learned, through observation and consequence, that disappearing from one another's lives was often the most responsible choice. When a woman sensed that her position was weakening, she sometimes preemptively loosened connections to spare others from the fallout. Though this act looked like abandonment, it was, in many cases, an attempt at protection. Staying close might draw unwanted scrutiny to friends or attendants who had never sought involvement in her troubles. By stepping back, she created space that shielded them, even if neither party spoke of it. This silent consideration formed one of the court's paradoxical truths. Separation could serve as a final gesture of care. Those who remained behind carried the weight of these quiet endings. They adjusted their days around absences, noticing the empty places where a familiar figure once stood during prayer, meals, or informal gatherings. Yet, they learned not to acknowledge these gaps, for inquiry risked attracting attention to a matter better left untouched. Questions could be seen as an interest, and interest could be interpreted as involvement, so they accepted the disappearance with outward calm, even when inwardly it added to the growing sense that relationships in the palace could not be trusted to endure. Over time, the cumulative effect of these dissolving ties shaped a collective atmosphere of solitude. Women moved through the palace as individuals more than as a community. They shared responsibilities, lived under the same roof, and faced the same uncertainties. Yet the emotional threads connecting them grew thinner with each silent ending. What remained was a form of coexistence, stripped of intimacy. They existed side by side without crossing the boundaries that experience had taught them to maintain. Memory played a complicated role in this process. Women remembered those they once trusted, But they learned to store these memories in a private place, untouched by the court's demands. Their recollections held moments of ease, gestures of kindness, or conversations that revealed unguarded thoughts. Yet memory could not sustain relationships that the present no longer allowed. As the court tightened its hold on their lives, these recollections lost their ability to influence current behavior. Memory became a quiet archive rather than a reason to reconnect. Eventually, even these archives faded. The court's pace, its crease, and its endless shifts in favor pushed old connections deeper into obscurity. Women forgot not because they lacked feeling, but because remembering offered no safety. Forgetting, or learning not to dwell on what once existed, became another form of self-preservation. The court taught them that emotional clarity carried risk, and so they accepted forgetfulness as a shield against unwanted vulnerability. Through this gradual erasure, relationships in the Tudor court demonstrated a final truth. Connection itself was a temporary condition shaped by fear and survival. Relationships dissolved not through conflict, but through necessity, leaving behind only faint impressions of something that once held meaning. The palace demanded this silence, and those who wished to remain learned to comply. These quiet dissolutions revealed how deeply the court's pressures reshaped the lives within it, allowing ties to fade into shadows rather than fracture openly. While familiarity dissolved into distance, a quieter truth emerged. Even bonds formed in sincerity could not withstand the palace's demands for caution and erasure. In this quiet unraveling, another layer of the court's fragile world came into view. It became increasingly clear that the Tudor court did not thrive on unity. The palace halls functioned more smoothly when the women inside them stood apart, watching one another with caution rather than trust. Divisions did not happen by accident, they were shaped quietly by the structures around them. Encouraged by the rhythms of a world ruled entirely by a single male authority, whose power required no justification, those who lived closest to that authority felt the pressure most intensely. Every small gesture, every lowered glance, every shift in loyalty created cracks that widened without effort. The court did not ask women to oppose each other directly. It simply placed them in positions where unity carried too much risk and isolation felt safer. The king's presence served as the central axis around which these tensions turned. His preferences, moods, and decisions determined the fate of each woman who lived within reach of his shadow. Proximity brought influence, but also danger, and the closer one stood, the more carefully she had to guard her steps. Rivalries formed not from malice, but from the unavoidable reality that only one woman could hold the recognized position at any given moment. Those beneath her, beside her, or waiting behind her learned quickly that mutual support had limits. If the balance shifted, even slightly, the consequences could fall unevenly across the women who had once shared confidence or companionship. This atmosphere shaped behavior in ways that few outside the court could understand. Servants, ladies in waiting, and noble women adjusted their loyalties constantly, gauging which association protected them and which exposed them to danger. The court rewarded separation. When women aligned too strongly with one another, the men above them took note. Influence concentrated among women was viewed as a threat, a potential challenge to the clarity of male authority. Subtle interventions followed. Assignments changed. Access was limited, and messages were passed through intermediaries to disrupt trust. These adjustments appeared procedural, but they were deliberate tools, ensuring that solidarity never lasted long enough to become meaningful. The most powerful mechanism of division came from uncertainty. Rumors traveled freely, and their origins rarely mattered. A quiet suggestion could shift relationships overnight. A woman who seemed secure might discover that the same court that once lifted her now viewed her as an obstacle. Those watching learned to interpret these shifts as warnings. Instead of questioning the system, they altered their own behavior to avoid the same outcome. In this way, division became embedded in daily life. Even small acts of kindness were filtered through caution, and hesitation replaced open exchange. What made the system so effective was its consistency. Women were encouraged to compete for a single point of approval, and competition required distance. The court never voiced this expectation openly. It did not need to. Each woman understood that her safety depended on appearing loyal to the crown above all else, even if loyalty demanded withdrawing from those around her. Bonds that might have grown stronger in a different environment remained shallow, carefully maintained, but never fully trusted. Every friendship carried a boundary formed by the awareness that one misstep could shift circumstances without warning. Observers who documented court life often misinterpreted these divisions as personal conflict. They wrote of jealous queens, scheming wives, and ambitious ladies, shaping stories that suggested individual failings rather than systemic pressures. The truth was less dramatic and far more bleak. Most women did not seek conflict. They adapted to a world that demanded distance and turned vulnerability into danger. The structure itself ensured that connections remained fragile. Relationships did not fracture because of anger or betrayal. They eroded because the cost of unity was simply too high. This system of division served the king well. A court of separated women posed no challenge to authority. They influenced events only in limited ways, and their weakened alliances prevented them from forming a collective voice. Even when they recognized the harm done to one of their own, caution stopped them from acting. Self-preservation was stronger than solidarity. Silence did not signal indifference. It reflected the realization that speaking out would endanger both the speaker and those connected to her. The court operated smoothly when women felt isolated from one another, and the crown relied on that isolation. Over time, the pattern became so common that it felt natural. The women who entered the court did not question it, because the system had shaped generations before them. Lessons were passed quietly from one household to the next. Avoid attachment. Measure every word. Protect your standing above your sentiment. These lessons ensured the system continued without resistance. The court did not need to enforce the division aggressively. It only needed to maintain the conditions that created it. And the women internalized these conditions as survival strategies. This environment produced an unspoken truth. Unity among women was not merely rare. It was dangerous. Any attempt to build lasting alliances risked attracting unwanted attention. The palace tolerated short-lived connections, but anything deeper threatened the order that kept power centered where it had always been. Those who understood this early survived longer. Those who did not learned painfully that trust painfully was a fragile currency in a court that benefited most when women stood apart rather than together. These patterns revealed how carefully the palace shaped its world, turning quiet divisions into a dependable method of control. While each woman struggled to maintain her footing alone, the system continued its steady work without resistance. Behind the polished image of royal order, another truth waited, showing how power could thrive only when those beneath it remained parted and cautious. Male authority shaped every corner of the Tudor court, leaving little room for women to move without stepping into positions defined long before they arrived. Rules were drafted, enforced, and interpreted by men. And these rules decided not only the structure of the palace, but also the choices available to the women who lived inside it. The system did not need to state openly that women must compete. The shape of the hierarchy made that competition unavoidable. Each woman understood that her stability depended on aligning with male expectations, and failure to do so could remove her from court life entirely. The weight of these expectations pressed quietly but steadily, shaping patterns of behavior that drew women into conflict, even when none of them sought it. The king's authority stood above all others, and his decisions determined which woman held the formal position of queen. That single place, and the influence attached to it, created an intense point of focus. Men around him framed the position not as a shared responsibility, but as a singular prize. This structure meant that every woman who came close to that role stepped into a narrow space where only one could remain. The court reinforced this idea through ceremony, through protocol, and through the attention it gave to the woman recognized as queen. The title elevated her, but it also isolated her. Those who had once stood beside her now shifted their stance, adjusting their behavior to avoid the appearance of rivalry or excessive loyalty. The space between women widened naturally under this pressure. Legal frameworks added further restrictions. Marriage laws in Tudor England, written and enforced by men, placed responsibility on women while offering them little protection. A queen could be set aside, accused, or condemned through procedures she had no power to challenge. Those watching learned quickly that the law belonged to the king and his advisors, not to the women it governed. This imbalance shaped their choices. To survive, they adapted to the system rather than confronting it. Resistance was too dangerous, and silence became the preferred response. In this way, male authority created an environment where women understood that standing alone offered more safety than standing together. The consequences of this structure fell almost entirely on the women. When a queen lost favor, she suffered publicly, and the court treated her fall as natural. Those who had supported her stepped back to distance themselves from the danger. No system existed to protect them from association, so withdrawal became the only reliable method of self-preservation. As each woman navigated her own survival, unity faded into caution. Moments of support existed, but they were brief and fragile. The court functioned on the assumption that women would not form lasting alliances because the system made such alliances costly. This environment transformed ordinary interactions into strategic decisions. A greeting, a shared glance, a seat chosen at a banquet. Each carried weight. Male advisors, observing from positions of authority, interpreted these signals and sometimes acted on them. The women involved had little control over how their actions were perceived. Their intentions mattered less than the narratives constructed around them. These narratives pushed women into roles they did not choose: ally, rival, threat, or tool. Once labeled, they struggled to change how the court saw them. The system held them in place, and movement required more than personal desire. It required permission. The requirement to compete for a single recognized position shaped the deeper conflict. Women were not encouraged to develop multiple roles or identities. Their value in the court was tied to their relationship with the king, and that value could rise or fall depending on his shifting interests. The men who enforced this structure did not deliberately seek to destroy female solidarity. They simply maintained a system built on the belief that unity among women offered no benefit to male power. By keeping roles limited and precarious, the court ensured that women would focus on individual survival rather than collective influence. Even outside the king's immediate circle, male authority continued to frame interactions. Fathers, brothers, and male relatives arranged marriages, negotiated positions, and determined the futures of women before they set foot in the palace. Expectations followed them into the court, shaping how they were perceived. A woman's conduct reflected not only on herself, but also on the men connected to her. This weight restricted her behavior further, narrowing her choices and increasing the likelihood of conflict with others placed under the same constraints. In this atmosphere, women became responsible for the consequences generated by rules they had no role in creating. Observing the court from a distance, one could see these pressures shaping outcomes again and again. Women who entered the palace with hopes of companionship found themselves measured by standards designed without their input. Their successes were temporary, their failures often severe. Even simple gestures of empathy carried risk. The system quietly punished solidarity and rewarded caution, ensuring that competition flourished in the spaces where unity might have existed. Over time, this pattern hardened into expectation. Women adapted by keeping their distance, by guarding their words, and by accepting that the court allowed only one of them to hold recognized influence at a time. This acceptance was not a sign of weakness, but a reflection of the limited choices available to them. They moved carefully through a world shaped entirely by male authority, knowing that the slightest misstep could shift their position in ways they could not control. This structure revealed how deeply the court depended on division, using its rules to guide women toward separate paths. While each sought safety inside narrow boundaries, the larger system continued undisturbed, reinforced by the very caution it created. Beneath this quiet tension, another truth waited, shaped by the weight of choices none of them had been allowed to make. Trust no longer found a place inside the Tudor court, not because the women lacked the desire for connection, but because the surroundings made such trust nearly impossible. Every hallway, every chamber, every conversation carried the weight of consequence. A misplaced word could be repeated, altered, or used as evidence. A gesture of sympathy might be interpreted as disloyalty. The palace doors opened each morning to a world where every woman knew she must shield herself first, and only consider others if the risk did not outweigh the safety she needed to maintain. In this setting, the idea of sisterhood faded from reality into something closer to memory. Relationships formed only when they served a purpose. A smile could hide calculation, and politeness often masked suspicion. Alliances appeared temporary, shaped by shared needs rather than genuine attachment. Women measured one another carefully, aware that the person offering comfort might later be forced to withdraw it without warning. No bond was safe from interruption. Even moments that resembled friendship were filtered through the constant awareness that each woman lived under pressure from forces larger than herself. The court reinforced these conditions with its unforgiving structure. Women were observed constantly, by servants, by rivals, by the men who held authority. Their behavior was read like text, interpreted, and dissected. Any expression of warmth risked creating ties that could be held against them. A shared secret might place two women in danger simultaneously. A shared grievance could become evidence of conspiracy. Quiet distance became the preferred form of protection, not because it offered comfort, but because it reduced the number of vulnerabilities others might exploit. This distance shaped daily life. Women exchanged greetings that felt formal, even when they had once been familiar. They walked carefully during gatherings, choosing where to stand based on who might be watching. Even private moments carried awareness of the palace's reach, walls too thin to guarantee silence, and servants too attentive to ignore. Women learned to speak cautiously, to smile modestly, to conceal emotion until they reached the rare places where they could be alone. Still, even those solitary moments held the residue of vigilance. Affection transformed into liability. A woman who appeared too close to another risked being drawn into her downfall. Support once offered in kindness could become a tie that dragged both women toward danger. Past examples reinforced this fear. Queens who had extended warmth saw their allies punished alongside them. Ladies who had shown loyalty learned that loyalty could be recast as suspicion. Each story deepened caution. Each fall of a prominent woman reminded the court that safety depended on maintaining a controlled distance. Inside this world, every connection carried an invisible cost. Women who once sought companionship adjusted their expectations. They limited their conversations, moderated their expressions, and avoided offering comfort that might be misread. Sisterhood became a luxury, something fragile, impractical, and nearly impossible to preserve under the palace's constant pressure. The court did not explicitly forbid closeness. It simply punished the consequences of closeness so consistently that most women abandoned the idea before attempting it. The emotional toll accumulated quietly. Women carried their fears alone, concealed behind the discipline the palace demanded. No one questioned why someone grew quieter, why someone else avoided eye contact, or why a sudden withdrawal from company occurred. These shifts were absorbed into the rhythm of palace life, where silence often said more than speech. Expressions of sorrow, joy, or concern were measured carefully. Anything too visible could lead to questions, and questions could lead to danger. Even gestures meant to convey kindness were filtered through caution. A hand placed gently on a shoulder lingered only for a second before being withdrawn. A whispered reassurance stopped short of revealing too much. Women learned to offer support without forming ties. They learned to care in ways that carried no promise and created no expectation. This form of affection was thin, almost ceremonial, but it was the safest option the court allowed. Over time, the absence of trust reshaped the atmosphere itself. Spaces that once echoed with conversation became quiet. Women passed one another politely but without warmth. Suspicion settled like a thin layer of dust over daily interactions, visible only to those who knew where to look. Even celebrations carried an undercurrent of restraint. Laughter felt softened, as though shaped by the knowledge that joy must not attract attention. Looking at the court from a distance, one could see how thoroughly its structure molded behavior. The palace did not need to command women to isolate themselves. It created conditions in which isolation became the only rational choice. Each woman understood her position depended on remaining unentangled, unexposed, and unaligned. Friendships still existed, but they were small, private, and fragile, held lightly, like objects that might break under too much weight. The disappearance of sisterhood was not dramatic. It did not collapse in a single moment. It faded slowly, covered by caution, until the absence felt normal. Women who arrived at court with hopes of companionship adjusted quickly, learning to measure every interaction. Those who had once known closeness carried the memory quietly, aware that the court no longer permitted such ties to survive. This quiet estrangement revealed how deeply fear shaped the rhythm of palace life, turning closeness into something rare and risky. While each woman guarded herself behind a controlled distance, the court continued to thrive on the separation it created. At that fragile edge, another shift gathered its shape, waiting to touch those who still believed caution could protect them. History tends to simplify what it does not wish to examine closely, and the Tudor court became one of its most convenient reductions. Over time, the queens who lived and struggled within its walls were remembered less as individuals, shaped by circumstance, and more as opponents locked in quiet competition. Their names drifted into stories told with sharp edges, as if rivalry had defined their intentions from the beginning. The complex pressures that molded their choices faded into silence, replaced by a narrative that invited easy judgment. What endured was not the truth of their lives, but the image of women set against one another. The queens' identities became tied to the roles assigned to them long after they could defend themselves. One was portrayed as steadfast, another as ambitious, another as fragile, and another as foolish. These portrayals ignored the weight of the world they inhabited, offering a simple picture of conflict instead. Audiences found it easier to view them as figures locked in competition for influence and survival. The nuances of their experiences rarely resurfaced, buried under layers of interpretation shaped by distance and male authority. The pressures they lived under disappeared from view. Their caution was mistaken for coldness, their strategic silence reinterpreted as hostility, and their attempts to adapt were seen as manipulations. Few remembered that each queen was responding to forces beyond her control: political demands, legal dangers, and shifting expectations dictated by men. These conditions shaped the decisions that later generations judged so quickly. Yet those later judgments rarely acknowledged the conditions themselves. As the years passed, the court transformed into a stage flattened by time. The women who had once moved through its corridors with measured fear were recast as symbols of rivalry. Their struggles became material for stories that emphasized conflict, while ignoring how deeply the court's structure restricted them. Many accounts preferred to highlight the visible outcomes rather than the invisible pressures. This choice distorted the truth, leaving behind a memory shaped more by impression than by reality. Even their moments of survival were misread. A queen who withdrew from danger appeared, calculating. One who tried to maintain calm seemed indifferent. One who displayed caution was framed as weak. These judgments followed them through centuries, as though their decisions came from personal failings rather than the unstable environment that dictated their options. Readers and historians often focus on their differences rather than the common challenges that defined their lives. The court's influence over their choices faded from discussion, leaving each woman to carry the weight of narratives that rarely aligned with her reality. This reshaping of memory affected more than individual reputations. It created a larger impression that women in the Tudor world were naturally inclined toward rivalry. The idea became so embedded in historical storytelling that few questioned it. Yet the environment itself had demanded caution, not competition. The structures controlled by men ensured that unity among women would remain fragile and difficult to maintain. When history remembered only their separations, it preserved the consequences while ignoring the cause. The silence surrounding their circumstances allowed misconceptions to grow. Stories often overlooked the political dangers that shaped their lives, choosing instead to emphasize personal tensions. Accounts that lacked context allowed the Queen's choices to appear self-driven rather than system-driven. Their fears, sacrifices, and losses faded behind the more dramatic narratives others preferred to tell. In this way, the court continued to influence its legacy long after it was gone. For many audiences, it became easier to envision these queens as rivals than as women navigating a dangerous world. The absence of context created room for assumptions that hardened into accepted truth. The complexity of their experiences, hope, fear, isolation, and caution was dissolved into a simplified pattern of conflict. What remained was a record that reflected the values of the storytellers rather than the lived realities of the women themselves. When viewed from a distance, the pattern reveals itself. History held tight to the outcomes, but released the circumstances that produced them. The Queen's struggles to survive an unstable environment were overshadowed by the fascination with their perceived competition. Their decisions, shaped by limited options, were transformed into evidence of rivalry. Their silences were treated as confessions, their caution as ambition, and their distance as hostility. The system that cornered them retreated into the background, leaving them alone to bear the weight of memory. This distortion extended even further. Later generations debated who was better, stronger, or more virtuous, framing the queens as contestants in a competition none of them had chosen. Few asked how much of their behavior had been shaped by fear, how often they acted from necessity rather than desire, or how many options they lacked. Their humanity dissolved into comparison, and the comparisons became a substitute for understanding. The long-term effect was a memory defined by division rather than insight. The queens remained separated in stories just as they had been separated by the pressures of the court. The narratives preserved their differences while neglecting the forces that created those differences. In this way, history replicated the very conditions that once kept them apart. This fractured remembrance revealed how easily stories can conceal the pressures that shape them, replacing context with judgment. While each queen carried the burden of decisions made under constraint, the world chose instead to remember the divisions. Along that quiet edge, another truth waited, asking how much of their story had ever truly belonged to them. Survival shaped every choice the Tudor queens made, not because they lacked loyalty or warmth, but because the court offered no safe ground on which those qualities could stand. Each woman stepped into a world that demanded constant awareness, where every decision carried consequences far beyond personal intention. What later appeared as betrayal often began as instinct, sharpened by fear and necessity. The court did not teach them to harm one another. It taught them that hesitation could harm themselves. Under such pressure, self-preservation became the only certainty the palace permitted. No queen entered the court seeking to abandon others. Yet the structure of power pressed them into corners where alliance carried danger. A gesture of trust might be interpreted as a conspiracy, A moment of honesty could be reshaped into an accusation. The walls around them listened, absorbed, and reshaped stories in ways none of them could predict. In that environment, survival was not merely a strategy, it was a requirement woven into every aspect of daily life. Those who lasted did so by recognizing that caution outweighed sentiment, and that the court rewarded distance, not loyalty. The choices they made reflected this reality. Protecting oneself did not mean rejecting others. It meant limiting how much of oneself could be exposed. Queens learned to measure their expressions, to shape their words with precision, and to withdraw when danger gathered its shape. When one queen fell, others stepped back, not out of cruelty, but because the court punished association with equal severity. Safety existed only in narrow spaces, carved by vigilance and maintained through restraint. The absence of trust did not reveal a flaw in the women. It revealed the hostility of the environment they lived within. Their caution was not selfishness, but a response to the unpredictability of male authority. They understood that the court's demands were inflexible and that any misjudgment could cost them their life. This awareness guided their steps, pushed them towards silence when empathy might have otherwise surfaced, and taught them that survival could require withdrawing even from those they admired or pitied. The force of power shaped every outcome. Affection did not erase danger, and closeness did not guarantee protection. Those who attempted to rely on sisterhood discovered quickly that the court structure provided no shelter for collective bonds. The palace rewarded those who adapted to its logic. One position, one influence, one queen. Anything that resembled unity among women disrupted that design. And those disruptions carried consequences none of them could control. In such a setting, the desire to survive overshadowed all other considerations. Viewed through this lens, their choices gained clarity. The queens did not turn away from one another out of malice. They turned away because the system allowed them no safe alternative. Each woman carried the weight of a life lived under scrutiny, where even the smallest gesture could shift her standing. Their ability to navigate this world required constant calculation, not out of desire for power, but out of fear of losing the little stability they possessed. The court made them responsible for outcomes they never intended, reinforcing patterns that shaped their memories long after they were gone. Their relationships faded, not because they lacked empathy, but because the cost of maintaining connection was too high. A friendship could transform into a liability overnight. A shared moment of honesty could become evidence. Even quiet companionship risked interpretation by those who watched from a distance, shaping narratives the women themselves could not correct. Their distance became a defense, and their silence a shield. The court's design left no room for anything different. A queen who aligned herself too closely with another woman risked sharing her downfall. A queen who extended sympathy risked exposing her own vulnerability. Those who survived longest learned to remain balanced between caution and visibility, shaping a quiet path that kept them close to the king's authority, but far from the shadows where suspicion gathered. This balance required discipline, not cruelty. The memory of these queens became distorted over time, reshaped by storytellers who favored rivalry over circumstance. Their caution was presented as hostility, their survival as ambition. Yet beneath these interpretations lay a simple truth. They acted as women who understood the danger of their world far better than history allowed. Their decisions were not betrayals, but reflections of fear, shaped by the knowledge that the court never offered them the freedom to choose differently. Those who judged them often overlooked the reality that the court punished empathy as readily as it punished error. The palace rewarded those who kept their distance, reinforced those who protected themselves, and eliminated those who failed to perceive danger quickly enough. Under such conditions, unity became an impossible expectation. The queens performed roles they did not write, bound by rules they did not create. Their lives revealed not the failings of women, but the brutality of a system that offered them no safe space to stand together. Reflecting on their stories reveals a deeper understanding of how helplessness can take shape behind grandeur. Their crowns carried weight far heavier than ceremony could display. Each queen learned that survival did not simply require caution. It required accepting that power could turn suddenly, without warning, and without mercy. Their actions, judged harshly by those who came after, were shaped by this constant tension. When seen through a quieter lens, the narrative shifts. Their distance becomes an act of protection. Their silence becomes a form of resistance. Their careful steps become expressions of awareness rather than rivalry. Each queen lived not as a figure seeking dominance, but as a woman navigating a world designed to test the limits of her endurance. This final pattern revealed how survival shaped every connection the queens might have shared, leaving them separated by fear rather than by intent. While each woman faced the palace's dangers alone, their stories carried a shared thread of caution and loss. Along that shadowed path, a quiet understanding lingered, reminding us that their choices sought safety in a world that offered none. And now, as the story settles into silence, I hope the steady rhythm of their lives guides you gently toward rest. May your night be calm, and may sleep find you softly. Good night.